We're moving into chapter 17 and 18 today. And as we discussed when we started into this section of Isaiah, back in chapter 13, there's 11 chapters here that are dealing with these oracles against some of the surrounding nations. And actually, in I think chapter 22, there's actually an oracle concerning Jerusalem. Where we started was in those oracles or those prophecies against Babylon in 13 and 14. And they really were looking at the judgments coming against Babylon because of their treatment of Judah and Jerusalem under Nebuchadnezzar. But as we moved into 14, we saw that there was also this spiritual component where Babylon not only represented the physical empire of Babylon, but also that Babylon represented a spiritual empire that was centered around these false religions, these idolatrous religions. There's also this component of the enemies of God, those who stand in opposition to God. So Babylon represents all of that in these prophecies in 13 and 14. When we moved into chapters 15 and 16, we saw these judgments then shift from Babylon to Moab. Now what's interesting is that at this time in Isaiah's life, Babylon really didn't pose a threat against Judah and Jerusalem. And Moab really did not pose a threat against Judah and Jerusalem. And as we talked when we were looking at these judgments against Moab and the Moabite people, that they didn't stem from the ignoble beginning of the Moabite people, because Moab, the patriarch of the Moabites, was, as I'm sure we all remember, the illegitimate, incestuous son of Lot and his older daughter. Moab knew God in their beginning because they were connected to Abraham through their father Lot, or their patriarch Lot down to the patriarch Moab. And I think these judgments against Moab stem from the fact that we see in the text that they had completely abandoned the Lord God in favor of these idolatrous, these false religions. So that now brings us into this next set of oracles or judgments or prophecies. And we see in chapters 17 and 18, we start with a judgment against Damascus. And then we move into a prophecy regarding Cush. But intertwined with all of this are the prophecies that also are speaking to the northern kingdom of Israel, or Ephraim, the restoration of Israel, and also against Assyria. This is chapter 17, verse 1, a prophecy against Damascus. See, Damascus will no longer be a city, but will become a heap of ruins. The cities of Aram will be deserted and left to flocks, which will lie down with no one to make them afraid. There are many who hold to the notion that Damascus is the oldest continuously inhabited city on earth. And that would seem to contradict this prophecy, that Damascus would be a city, would no longer be a city, but become a heap of ruins. The thing is, we know Damascus has been destroyed and rebuilt several times. I mean, there's archaeological digging going on in and around where Damascus is today. So we know it has been destroyed and rebuilt several times. And I think if you look at what this prophecy is saying, it says, see, Damascus will no longer be a city, but will become a heap of ruins. If you look back at pictures of Europe, especially Germany, toward the end of and after World War II, you see cities that are little more than heaps of ruins. And yet they're still inhabited. People living among the rubble. I think that's very possible with what we're talking about here in Damascus. that the city has been reduced to ruins, reduced to rubble, but that it's still inhabited, which is how it could be fulfilling this prophecy of being reduced to ruins and yet still be the oldest continuously inhabited city on earth. And then verse 2 talks about the cities of Aram. And from what I was doing in my research for this study, the cities of Aram seem to be referring to what we might call the outskirts of Damascus, the area surrounding Damascus. And of course, we know one of the things the Assyrians did when they came in and conquered a people was they started deporting the people from the conquered territory into other areas within the Assyrian Empire. That would seem to fit well with this notion that the cities of Aram will be deserted and left to flocks because they'll be depopulated because of these deportations, and that there'll be no one around to cause these flocks, probably wild sheep at this point, to be afraid. That brings us to verse 3. The fortified city will disappear from Ephraim, and the royal power from Damascus, the remnant of Aram, will be like the glory of the Israelites, declares the Lord Almighty. In that day the glory of Jacob will fade, the fat of his body will waste away. I think we can determine from verse 3 that this is referring to this war between the kingdoms of Aram or Syria and Ephraim, or the northern kingdom of Israel, because they had formed an alliance and had marched against Judah and Jerusalem. This is referring to the war that existed between Aram and Ephraim and then the Assyrians. And it's interesting, verse 3 talks about the royal power from Damascus will be like the glory of the Israelites. And then verse 4 explains what the glory of the Israelites will become, that it will fade, the glory of Jacob will fade, and the fat of his body, in other words, all that the Lord had blessed the northern kingdom with, would waste away. Verse 5 says, this period that we're talking about here, when the Assyrians are coming in and overcoming Aram, Damascus, Ephraim, Samaria, it will be as when reapers harvest the standing grain, gathering the grain in their arms, as when someone gleans heads of grain in the valley of Rephaim. So this period, this glory of Jacob will fade, and it will appear like a field of wheat after it's been harvested. Now, if you go through the area here and some of the fields of winter wheat that you see that are being harvested right now, and you look out into those fields that have been harvested, you'll look out and you'll see occasional stalks of grain still standing. And that's what this is compared to. This glory of Jacob, this glory of Damascus, this land is going to look like that field, it just has the odd stalk of wheat still standing in it. And what's interesting is this reference here to the valley of Rephaim, because the valley of Rephaim refers to a fertile plain that was located southwest of Jerusalem. And I think the significance of that is these prophecies that Isaiah is delivering here are being delivered primarily for the benefit of the people in Judah and Jerusalem. I think one of the things we've looked at in the past in this study is the idea that the prophecies against the northern kingdom, the prophecies against Damascus and Aram, the prophecies against Assyria, are all being given as a warning to the people of Judah and Jerusalem. Basically, don't abandon God as these other nations that have been judged have abandoned God, or those judgments will fall on you. And verse 6 continues, "Yet some gleanings will remain, as when an olive tree is beaten, leaving 2 or 3 olives on the topmost branches, 4 or 5 on the fruitful boughs, declares the Lord, the God of Israel. What's interesting, olives are harvested today much like they were back in biblical times. They shake the tree, or they shake the branches. Sometimes they have rakes that they'll go up into the tree and rake down, but even the big mechanical harvesters they have essentially go through and shake the tree as the harvester goes down the row of olive trees, and the olives fall off into the conveyor belts and then are taken up into the hoppers where they're stored until they're sent off to the wagons, taking them off to the processing plant. I believe what Isaiah is saying here, what the Lord is saying through Isaiah, is that there will be a remnant left behind, much like when the olive tree, the olives are harvested, there are always olives left on the tree, even today. So in essence, I think what the Lord is showing Israel here is that there will be a remnant who will remain in the land. Most of the people are going to be deported, but there will be a remnant who will remain in the land. Then verse 7 says, "In that day people will look to their Maker and turn their eyes to the Holy One of Israel. They will not look to the altars, the work of their hands, and they will have no regard for the Asherah poles and the incense altars their fingers have made." Verse 4, here in verse 7, and then again in verse 9, we see that phrase, "in that day." And "in that day" has often referred to the time that we refer to as the end of the age, the day of the Lord, the time when Messiah comes and establishes his kingdom and mankind is judged and so forth. But I think here these are referring to a more immediate execution of these prophecies. I believe these are these near-term judgments being spoken against Aram and Ephraim. Once the people in the northern kingdom come to the realization that their false gods are unable to save them, I think at that point is when they will return, or at least attempt to return, to the Lord God of Israel. Because remember, there has not been a single righteous king in the northern kingdom from the time when Jeroboam broke away from Rehoboam after Solomon's death. There has not been a single righteous king. And the first king, Jeroboam, actually erected golden calves, I believe, at the northern and southern ends of the kingdom to be representational of God. But by the time we move into the period of Ahab and Jezebel, they have brought the full-blown worship of Baal and Asherah into the northern kingdom. And that's what it's referring to here. They will have no regard for their Asherah poles. These were, well, today we call them maypoles. And you've seen the lovely maidens dancing around the maypole on the 1st of May every year. In ancient times, that was actually a fertility rite. Think about that the next time you're at a May Day celebration. The people of the northern kingdom had lost God's favor. God had withdrawn his hand of protection. And God had said, enough. We know from the scriptures that God is long-suffering. He's very patient. But he's also not infinitely suffering. Eventually, we will wear his patience out. And we kind of see that now as we move into this description of what's taking place in verse 9. It says, "In that day their strong cities, which they left because of the Israelites, will be like places abandoned to thickets and undergrowth, and all will be desolation." Now, verse 9 is a little confusing. And I struggled with it as I was putting this together until I began to realize what this is talking about. Their strong cities, which they left because of the Israelites. I think this is referring to the invasion of the Assyrians under Tiglath-Pileser, when he came down through Aram, Damascus, into the northern part of Ephraim, the northern kingdom. He came down, but he didn't stop with conquering the northern kingdom. He moved on into Judah and laid siege to Jerusalem. and left behind, either built or taken over, left behind these fortified cities. So I think what this is saying is their strong cities, the Assyrian strong cities, which the Assyrians left behind because of the Israelites, in other words, an occupying force to control the Israelites. While Tiglath-Pileser and the Assyrian army moved against Judah and Jerusalem. And of course, remember, King Ahaz had allied with Tiglath-Pileser because of the attack being brought against him from Aram and Ephraim. Isaiah had said, don't worry about it, Jerusalem won't fall. Not only will Jerusalem not fall to Aram and Ephraim, Jerusalem isn't going to fall to the Assyrians. And of course, King Ahaz said, I don't care. I don't have an army big enough. Tiglath-Pileser does. He's my buddy. These fortified cities left behind because of the Israelites to control the population while Tiglath-Pileser attempted to move against Judah and Jerusalem. And then the final deportation, which began under Tiglath-Pileser, wasn't actually finished. That's why these cities were left behind during this period of occupation. The final deportation and conquest of the northern kingdom was not completed until the reign of Sargon II. He's the one about 50 years later who then comes in, finishes the conquest of the northern kingdom, and deports the bulk of the population back into the eastern section of the Assyrian Empire. And then we come down to the reason. God restates the reason for this judgment against the northern kingdom. Verse 10, you have forgotten God your Savior. You have not remembered the rock, your fortress. Therefore, though you set out the finest plants and plant imported vines, though on the day you set them out, you make them grow, and on the morning when you plant them, you bring them to bud, yet the harvest will be as nothing in the day of disease and incurable pain. We saw in chapters 15 and 16 the utter destruction of Moab and the Moabite people. And we saw a couple of places in Isaiah's narrative where you hear him talking about how his heart cries out for this destruction he's seeing being brought against the Moabite people. Even God talking about how his heart is bleeding for these people who have abandoned him. And in part, I think we see a little of that here in chapter 17. Because we start off at the beginning, fairly harsh words from God. But then we see as we move down into the chapter, you can almost sense a reluctance on the part of God to bring these judgments against the children of Israel, the 10 northern tribes. But he gives this reason here again. And then we see this tone of harshness return as we finish out the chapter in these last 3 verses. Because these last 3 verses aren't speaking to the northern kingdom. They're not speaking to the children of Israel. I believe they're speaking to the conquering power, which is Assyria. Woe to the many nations that rage. They rage like the raging sea. Woe to the peoples who roar. They roar like the roaring of great waters. Although the peoples roar like the roar of surging waters. When he rebukes them, they flee far away, driven before the wind, like chaff on the hills, like tumbleweed before a gale. In the evening, sudden terror, before the morning they are gone. This is the portion of those who loot us, the lot of those who plunder us. Like I said, I think verses 12 and 13 are talking about the Lord's coming storm against those who are attacking and carrying Israel off into captivity. And I think that is seen well in verse 14 because it talks about these judgments God is talking about in 12 and 13. It talks about these are the portions of those who loot us, Israel. those who plunder us, again, Israel. Remember the blessing that God gave Abraham, the promise God gave Abraham, that whoever blessed Abraham would be blessed, and whoever cursed Abraham would be cursed. And I believe the context of that, to me, seems to indicate not just Abraham, but Abraham's descendants. In other words, ultimately, the children of Israel. That brings us into chapter 18, which is labeled a prophecy against Cush. Ancient Cush was an area that incorporated parts of southern Egypt and parts of modern-day Sudan and parts of modern-day Ethiopia. Some translations simply say Ethiopia instead of Cush. And there's an intriguing issue with verse 1 here in chapter 18. It involves this first word, which in the NIV is translated woe. In the Hebrew, this word is the word hoi. I hope I got that right. I don't speak Hebrew. Hoi. And it can be translated woe. It is translated woe. But what's interesting is that it can also be translated alas, ho, or oh, basically as an interjection. And I think that's a better translation, especially given what follows in verses 2 and 3 in this opening section of chapter 18. I think a better translation would be, alas, the land of whirring wings along the rivers of Cush. Because God isn't pronouncing a woe against Cush. I think what he's doing is he's issuing a warning to Cush about their future. Verse 1, I'm going to use alas. Alas, the land of whirring wings along the rivers of Cush, which sends envoys by sea in papyrus boats over the water. Go, swift messengers, to a people tall and smooth-skinned, to a people feared far and wide, an aggressive nation of strange speech, whose land is divided by rivers. All you people of the world, you who live on the earth, when a banner is raised on the mountains, you will see it, and when a trumpet sounds, you will hear it. Couple of thoughts as to the meaning of the land of whirring wings. Some commentators think this may be a reference to the number of insects that are present in this area we call Cush. And I think that's certainly a possibility. But I think it's a better reference, especially given what we see in verse 2. I think it's a better reference to see these whirring wings as the sails on these papyrus boats. Because if you think about it, if you ever see a sail on a windy day, especially on a river, it flutters like a wing. And verse 2 refers then to Cush sending envoys by sea in these papyrus boats. It is thought among some commentators, some interpreters, that this might be referring to a period when Cush had actually moved north into Egypt and had subdued Egypt. They were then seeing the Assyrians marching south along the Mediterranean coast, realizing that they couldn't take the Assyrians. So what they've done is they've sent envoys to Judah and Jerusalem to speak with the king. At this point, probably either late in Ahaz's reign or early in Hezekiah's reign. But they've sent envoys to Jerusalem to speak with the king about forming an alliance against Assyria. Now it talks about, in verse 2, it says, Go, swift messengers, to a people tall and smooth-skinned, to a people feared far and wide, an aggressive nation of strange speech whose land is divided by rivers. Well, what's interesting is that this area we call Cush represents the headwaters of the Nile River. The White Nile flowing one way and the Blue Nile flowing another way. But this is a land very much divided by rivers. The Ethiopians were seen as tall and smooth-skinned, and they were not Semitic people. So their language would have been foreign. So I think even the Assyrians spoke somewhere in the Semitic languages. So I think this is referring this people, tall and smooth-skinned, feared far and wide, an aggressive nation of strange speech. From a land divided by rivers, I think this is referring to the Ethiopian army, or if you will, the army of Cush. And these messengers are told to swiftly go with the message contained in verse 3. All you peoples of the world, you who live on earth, when a banner is raised on the mountains, you will see it, and when a trumpet sounds, you will hear it. I think what we're seeing here is now these prophecies that have been specifically aimed at Ephraim, Aram, Assyria, are beginning to expand into a broader prophecy. When we see the reference to all the peoples of the world, all the peoples who live on earth, I think we're talking about a time when God would be dealing with the whole earth. And I believe he's using Assyria as the representation of these coming judgments. Because that's what we saw at the end of chapter 17, those two verses that appear to be talking about the coming conqueror of Israel, the northern kingdom. But Assyria is only the starting place. This is to be an anticipation. The people of the world, the people of earth, are told to watch for a banner to be raised. And of course, in ancient times, that would be a sign of a war starting, because that's what armies would do, is they would rally under a banner. And then the trumpet would sound to mark the beginning of the battle itself. Verse 4, this is what the Lord says to me. I will remain quiet and will look on from my dwelling place, like shimmering heat in the sunshine, like a cloud of dew in the heat of harvest. For before the harvest, when the blossom is gone and the flowers become a ripening grape, he will cut off the shoots with pruning knives and cut down and take away the spreading branches. They will be left to the mountain birds of prey and to the wild animals. The birds will feed on them all summer, the wild animals all winter. The Lord's judgment is coming. If God did not spare a people, the apple of his eye, the children of Israel, from his judgment, can we expect to escape what's coming as God begins these final judgments against earth and the people of earth? I think what the prophet is telling the people here, I will remain quiet and look on from my dwelling place. I think what the prophet is telling the people here is that God is patient. He will stay in the background. He will simply watch, for the time being, those who would oppose him. But when the time comes for action, the prophet describes a scene that would have been very familiar to those people of the time, would be very familiar to any vine dresser today, because he describes how a vineyard would be tended by the vine dresser. Of course, in this case, God being the vine dresser, the earth being the vineyard. Excess blossoms need to be pinched off. Excess leaves need to be trimmed off. And of course, if you have a branch that has sprouted no flowers, is not producing grapes, the branch will be pruned off. And then, of course, these cuttings are left to fall to the ground. This is all done so these unproductive portions don't steal nutrients from the productive elements of that grapevine. Metaphorically, then, they will be left to the birds of prey and the animals in the wild. Verse 7, at that time. And I think at that time here now is referring to this future time when Messiah has come and has reestablished the kingdom of Israel and has established his millennial reign. And we move into that 1,000-year time under Messiah. At that time, gifts will be brought to the Lord Almighty from a people tall and smooth-skinned, from a people feared far and wide, an aggressive nation of strange speech, whose land is divided by rivers. The gifts will be brought to Mount Zion, the place of the name of the Lord Almighty. So just as I think we see Assyria representing those who stand in opposition to God, these Cushites now represent those who have heard the call of God because of that reference to all the people on earth, all who live on earth, will bring gifts to the temple, bring gifts to the Lord in Jerusalem. And the children of Israel. And by that I do mean, as Paul talks about in Romans, not the physical descendants of Abraham, but the spiritual descendants of Abraham. The children of Israel will be gathered to celebrate this time with Messiah and in his kingdom. Any questions? Okay, move into chapter 19 next week. Thank you.